Casey carried the book of 7 poisons back to Arthur's cave. Inside, the shelves were full of jars and boxes and bottles, all full of different types of poison. He studied the different containers curiously. Then, he caught a sparkle out of the corner of his eye. He turned. It was his great-grandfather's satchel hanging on a shelf. Casey fingered the ruined leather, remembering the lightning that had brought him here. The sudden thunder, the downpour of rain. It felt like a lifetime ago. The edges of the bag were charred. Pieces of leather flaked off and fell to the cave floor. Very carefully, Casey opened the bag, wondering if there was anything inside. He hadn't even had a chance to look before he was transported here. The bag fell to pieces. Casey frowned as he looked down at the remains. Was it his imagination, or were there glints of gold hidden among the brown leathers? He knelt and plucked out a shimmering rectangular piece, turning it this way and that to catch the light. It was a tiny door. He rooted through the rest of the pile and found a piece that looked very much like the roof of the Golden Pagoda. He sat back on his heels, and a smile spread across his face. Perhaps the Golden Pagoda hadn't just appeared out of nowhere after all. Suddenly, it seemed like a gift. He retrieved the old book that he'd found inside the tower. If his great-grandfather had somehow sent him the Tower of Light, then maybe he had sent Casey the book too. Casey found a seat near the edge of the cave and opened the book. He rubbed his chin. The spells inside began to look less sinister to him. He studied the spell for poison magic. His nerves flustered. Fusing Arthur's poisons with his spirit to achieve a higher level of magic sounded insane. But what if his great-grandfather was trying to help him? Casey rubbed his temples. I'm full of poison already, and it'll kill me eventually anyway. He looked out the mouth of the cave at the bare rocks and gray sky. Is this what you want, great-grandfather? Silence answered. Casey sighed. Okay then. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and muttered, Bottoms up. Casey tried to let go of his fears. He'd never meditated before in his life, but the spell talked about having a strength of mind, so he tried to focus, to use the magic that Arthur had cultivated within him by plying him with poison. Slowly, like the old satchel falling apart, Casey's fears disintegrated and melted away. He could feel Arthur's poisons in his body. They had circulated through his blood and bones, into his muscles and tendons, his heart and brain. The only place the poison hadn't managed to get into was his spirit. Casey bit his lip nervously. Was he really going to just let this vile stuff into his spirit on purpose? He shuddered. That was the impossible end goal, but he had to control the poison first. Casey focused his magical will on the deadly compounds circulating throughout his body. The poison almost seemed to hiss in answer, like a viper. Casey pushed at it, trying to get it to move, but it resisted. It was like pressing on a locked door. He clenched his teeth. He needed to separate the poison from his body. But how? He became aware of the magic inside him. It pulsed in his veins. Hesitantly, he reached out to it, drawn by the heavy thrum of power. Come on, he gritted his teeth, focusing all his effort. Work with me. Casey cried out with exertion, letting out a wordless scream of pure determination. In a flash, the magic went from heavy and slow-moving, as though he were trying to turn a tank, to fast as a whip and lighter than air. It was golden and glowing, ready to go where Casey commanded. He let out a whoop of joy. Your turn! He could see the poison deep inside him, like a dark ooze in his arteries, like lead in his bones. Arthur's poisons, They had built up one by one, enough to trigger his ability to cultivate magic. Casey squeezed his eyes shut tight and sent up a prayer of gratitude. In a way, he had Arthur to thank for his newfound abilities, for being magical at all. He turned his attention to the poison and threw all of his magic toward it. When magic met poison, a flash of glowing green light filled the space between Casey's closed eyes. Sparks flew as though he'd struck metal. The poison surged upward. He knew it was going for his spirit. If he didn't beat the poison there, if he couldn't control it, the poison would consume him. Only by harnessing the danger himself could he turn it into poison magic and use it to raise his cultivation. Ah! Casey used all his might to stop the poison, but it wasn't enough. With every passing moment, he wasn't sure how long he struggled in the waking world. The poison gained ground, inch by inch. His confidence faltered. His nerves jangled with fear. It was too late to turn back. If he lost this battle, he would die. But he was no longer sure he could win. Sweat poured down Casey's face. His body trembled. Just when he thought it would devour his spirit forever, something shook loose inside him. An arrow of golden light flared in his chest like a small sun. It burst through the poison attacking Casey's spirit and fused with his magic. As his magic absorbed the golden light, Casey felt the battle inside him turn in his favor. Yes! His heart soared. Somehow, the Tower of Light had given him its strength. This was a battle he could win. He wrapped the poison with magic. The poison sizzled, fighting the magic like oil mixing with water. Casey balled up his fists. With every ounce of his strength, he sent the mixture of poison and magic into his spirit. An explosion of green light filled his vision, and he fell back onto the floor of the cave. His breaths came in short bursts. Every nerve ending in his body ached with pain. Slowly, Casey opened his eyes and smiled. His spirit now glowed bright green, like Arthur's magic. He'd done it, but not alone. He sat up and bowed his head to the golden pagoda inside him. Thank you, Tower of Light. He pressed his hands together. Without your help, I could have died. Thank you, great-grandfather. He looked around. He was all alone at the mouth of the cave. He laughed sheepishly. The battle inside him felt as though it had taken months, maybe even a year. If anyone had watched his struggle, they would surely have been perplexed to see him just sitting there for ages in a battle of the mind and spirit. But every moment had been worth it. He felt stronger than he'd ever felt before. He'd done as the spell suggested. He had cultivated poison magic. A low voice came out of nowhere and Casey jumped. Foundation level 7. It sounded a little like Arthur. Casey's brows rose in shock. He twisted to see if the old man was behind him. There was no one in the cave. In fact, he wasn't sure if the voice had been inside his head or outside it. Foundation level 7. Casey frowned. He remembered the look on Arthur's face as he lay dying. A typical Arthur look. Kind of sly, as though he knew something Casey didn't. Perhaps Arthur had given him more than just magic when he passed his power to Casey. Casey let out a pent-up breath and went to wipe his forehead. As he lifted his hand, an arc of green light shot out of his palm and lanced past his face. Crack! Casey's jaw dropped as the ray of green light went straight through a large boulder at the mouth of the cave, slicing it in two. Where the light had touched the rock, the edges glowed green and bubbled, as if touched by acid. As he watched in amazement, The boulder was quickly reduced to a pool of molten rock. Casey looked at his palm, then down at the Book of 7 Poisons, which was still sitting in his lap. He picked up the book and leafed to the next page. "Spirit Sword Technique," he read aloud. He let the book fall, a smile spreading across his face. Was he good at this? He'd never been good at anything in his life. If this was level 7, what did level 8 look like? He chuckled and shot out his hand, palm facing the valley outside the cave. 1, 2, 3! Like a martial artist blocking an uppercut. He pushed himself to his feet and wandered back into the cave, back to the poisons and herbs on the shelves. He lifted a sprig of some leafy, green, dried herb. It seemed a shame to leave Arthur's apothecary behind. It was like the last library of Toxic Gate, the only remaining stronghold of Arthur's knowledge. The Tower of Light glowed warmly, almost like a nudge. Casey turned his gaze inward curiously. The golden tower was beckoning to him. He closed his eyes, the sprig of dried herb still in his hand. As he did so, the herb winked out of reality like a burst bubble. Through some magic unknown to Casey, the herb was now stored inside the Tower of Light. He marveled at this new magic. This would come in handy. He walked around the cave looking for treasure to hold. The Book of 7 Poisons, for sure. Some poisons that might be helpful. He didn't know much about Arthur's collection, but it seemed right to preserve the apothecary. At last, Casey's strength waned and he started to slump. He was pretty sure he'd been inside the cave for months cultivating poison magic. He needed fresh air. As fresh as the air could be in this place. He walked back to the mouth of the cave, intending to go outside to turn his face to the weak sun. As he stepped out onto the rocky ground, he heard a sharp hiss to his left. Casey's head whipped around, his heart pounding in his chest. It was a giant python. As Casey's foot landed, he pivoted, throwing out his hand. The snake pounced.